Do you guys want to hear the most powerful yeehaw in American history?
Yeah!
Welcome to part 2 of my video on some of my favorite childhood games. If you didn't watch part 1, excellent news. It doesn't matter at all, so just keep blinking your eyes one at a time until the mid-roll ad plays. In part 1, I mentioned that I was reviewing a 3-pack of games sold by Hasbro Interactive, and in that video, I went over Beast Wars and Frogger. Recently, there has been some evidence brought forward that this was actually a 4-pack of games, and I think that might be correct, because I also played the shit out of Worms 2. But this video isn't about Worms 2, even though it is the second best Worms game. In this video, I will be going over the third, final, and by far the best out of these 3 games. A game almost too insane to even be real. Without any context, my endgame team was a demon in a cowboy hat, blonde Rambo, Thor, a riot cop, and Florence Nightingale. Trading out Groucho Marx for Thor was a tough call, but it was one that needed to be made. This is HEDZ. HEDZ was developed by Vis Interactive, a very much long-dead French game developer. HEDZ is basically an arena shooter, but not just any arena shooter. It's an insane French Pokemon Super Smash Bros. Arena shooter. The premise for this game is that these gross purple aliens have traveled through all of space and time, stealing the heads of various humans, animals, and other freaks, and then they can put on that head like a horrifying skin mask and take on the power of the person whose head that used to be. It's an insane premise, but also a genius way to justify your game having 225 playable characters without needing to do any dumb bullshit like world building. With this premise, everything is on the table. You want to play as a gorilla? Do it. You want to play as Richard Nixon? No one can stop you. And yes, you're not having a stroke. I said 225 playable characters. And none of these are recolors or palette swaps. These actual maniacs really did model 225 unique heads. The characters range from historical figures like Napoleon, Marilyn Monroe, Richard Nixon, and Sylvester Stallone to mythological characters like Shiva, Icarus, Thor, and Zeus. All of them, of course, are given original character do not steal names, like Short French General. These purple aliens didn't assassinate Richard Nixon. They assassinated Big Boss. You also get a lot of complete nonsense, like this guy with an aircraft carrier for a face, or this guy with a shotgun for a nose, or just fantasy tropes like this goblin. But I'm getting ahead of myself. How does any of this actually work in terms of gameplay? You start out in level 1 with your 5 starter characters. You progress through the level by defeating enemies to get keys. Defeated enemies will also drop their heads, which you can collect. You exit the level by standing on this red square. Every time you finish a level, you come out with a few more heads. That's literally all this game is. It's an arena shooter collectathon, and it fucking slaps. So let's get into character design first. How does this game have 225 unique characters? Well, it kind of doesn't. The game has a set amount of archetypes, and each character fits into one of the archetypes. The Goblin is an archer. He shoots arrows that do a ton of damage, but he can only shoot 4 times before he needs to recharge. The Crusader, the Robin Hood, and the Cupid are also under the archer category, so they're kind of just upgrades of one another. Some archetypes can also be combined in one character. For example, Cupid is also flying. This means that rather than choosing a loadout of characters, what you're really kind of doing is choosing a loadout of weapons. If you want a medic to heal your other characters, you're always going to be using the best medic on hand. If you like characters with missile abilities like Thor and missile hands, then you're going to pick the best missile heads. And they do have a semi-detailed stat system that you can use to determine which ones are better. Heads you find early in the game, like this troll, will eventually be phased out by heads you find later with the same abilities. So it is a little disingenuous to be like, look at all those characters, because odds are you'll probably only use the good ones. Unless you decide to do a challenge run. For example, one time I played through this entire game only using characters that were primarily green. I should also mention that if you want a challenge, make sure you check the game's difficulty settings because it's set to easy by default. Level design in Heads is also amazing. You get all these wide open arenas that are perfect for the game's chaotic shooting mechanics and high-speed movement. The last 2 levels are kind of a nightmare because they require you to use characters that can fly, which controls like shit and kind of ruins the game's arena shooter aesthetic. But other than that, the other 18 levels are perfect. There are plenty of secrets to find and hidden heads that you can unlock by finding them behind hidden walls or in hidden places you have to open with big switches. The levels are big enough to make you want to explore, but not so big that it feels overwhelming. Just really fantastic early 3D level design. There is the insane problem of not being able to replay levels though. After you beat a level, it will be locked in that save file. I have no idea why this is. You can replay levels right after you finish them, but you can't replay them after leaving this screen. Even if you beat the final level and save, all 20 levels will be locked and you'll be stuck on the level select screen. This makes the game a complete nightmare for completionists because if you're like me and you get to the final level and you're missing like 4 heads, too bad, better restart. I'm fairly sure that every level in the game has 1 secret head with the exception of the first level which has 2. So I think the obvious assumption to make is that if you haven't found the secret, you aren't looking hard enough. That being said, this game is obscure enough to where there aren't really any full guides online, so that could be completely wrong and I would have no way of fact checking it. The only other real negative to this game that I could see some people having is just its repetitive nature. Every level is pretty much the same thing, there's not a lot of variety in gameplay. And there are only 5 archetypes for levels, so you're going to be seeing these jungle assets quite a few times. That's all pretty frustrating, but now it's time to get into the real heartbreaking truth behind this game. And that's this. Heads was designed to be multiplayer. It has a multiplayer mode, one that I've never played because by the time I got my hands on it, the community was either dead or never even existed in the first place. Not to mention, playing games online back in the late 90s and early 2000s was much harder than it is now. But being designed to be multiplayer goes farther than just having a multiplayer mode. There are some heads that are very clearly designed to counter each other. The 2 types of crowd control, fountains and cells, will lock you in place, and they can only be countered by shielding to break out. Anti-aircraft type heads will shoot in first person, allowing you to scan the air for flying enemies. This poster specifically mentions archers as an intended counter for vehicles. It was really obvious that these guys wanted to develop a weird cartoon arena shooter with deep counterplay. It was obvious they were trying to create some kind of a metagame. Every time you swap out heads, you will get a unique sound effect. The idea behind this was probably to give players a sound cue in multiplayer to quickly switch their own character to get ready to counter whatever they were hearing. This also goes a long way to explaining the simplicity of the game's single-player mode. Single-player was probably supposed to just be a tutorial you play through to unlock characters, while the real show was intended to be multiplayer. I can only really imagine how fun this game's multiplayer probably was or wasn't if it had been fleshed out. From what I can tell looking at rare footage of the game's multiplayer mode, it revolved around heads randomly spawning and players quickly scrambling to pick them up. This feels very much like the beta version of multiplayer. My suspicion is that the game mode was never completed. Randomly distributing heads does kind of help mitigate balance issues since it's all just a dice roll, so that also may have played a role. Despite the multiplayer possibly being fun, and the single player being a very unique hallucination, this game never really caught on. Why is that? Well, H.E.D.Z was released in 1998. You might be thinking, so, what was so great about 1998? Let's just say this game had some pretty stiff competition. The song used for that section was a part of this game's great soundtrack. Like Frogger, the soundtrack appears to be broken on a lot of modern machines, but it has been uploaded to YouTube. The jungle levels used this song to really lean into their 1960s Vietnam-themed design. The horror-themed levels used this one. I don't remember what levels used this one, but it rules. Alright, it's time for me to mention my final sort of bittersweet point about H.E.D.Z. This game is at risk of going extinct. It can't run on any operating system beyond Windows 7, and unlike Frogger and Beast Wars, it wasn't released on a platform like the PS1 that can be kept alive through emulation. Vis Interactive went out of business almost 20 years ago, and they parted out all of their rights to up-and-coming developers that also almost for sure have since vanished. It's entirely possible that no one owns this game. It's probably just a forgotten, truly hidden gem that you can't play unless you're lucky enough to have the original disc or find a safe ISO download online and happen to have a PC running an operating system that is either Windows 7 or something even older. I didn't want to give details on playing the other games because it gets legally dubious, but H.E.D.Z is so profoundly lost that I don't mind trying to give people a few more details on how to play it, and I genuinely believe it's worth a play just to experience how goofy of a ride it is. My Abandonware has a pretty good reputation for being a safe site, and this site offers a free ISO download for H.E.D.Z. But, like I said, you need to be running an old operating system to actually play it. I got it running on Windows 7, but it won't function for 8 or 10 for technical reasons. The game can also be made to run without a disk if you use a hex editor to do this. So, if you have the time or the patience to get it running, maybe do your part to keep this game alive for a little bit longer. If you're running it on Windows 7, you'll get crashes on this level, though. I think it has something to do with the game having a hard time rendering Isaac Newton. Just try not to look at him and you'll get through the level eventually. R.I.P. H.E.D.Z. If only Reddit was around to jack up the stock price of Vis Interactive by 4,000%. If you want to see more videos like this one, consider subscribing, and of course, clicking the cursed bell. A comment and a like will also really help out. I also have an active Discord community that you can join with the link below, and finally, you should follow me on Twitter so you don't miss any important updates. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.